It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you tonight. This is the first time I've ever addressed a livery company, so it's an interesting privilege. And this is a timely thing, and there's a lot of challenges here. I think the other thing I'd flag up at the top is I'm very much a policy guy, and it's a real pleasure to speak to a bunch of such distinguished engineers. So I will do my best, but there may be limits to how much I can talk about the deep technicalities of construction process and stuff like that. But I hope what I have to offer will be interesting and provide you with food for thought. So just to run over what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to give you a little intro to sort of who we are at the CCC and what we do, and then talk a bit about progress to date, both in the context of net zero more widely and building specifically, the scale of the challenge we face, decarbonising homes here in the UK. Thought you would be interested to know about the sort of changes that you could make in your own homes, or sort of the changes that we need to make in existing and new homes to get us to net zero. So I'll touch on that. And then lastly, just a sort of a little summary about what the government is doing about buildings right now in the wake of its heat and building strategy and net zero strategy. I know what I've done this on timings. So we are the Climate Change Committee, formerly known as the Committee on Climate Change. We are a body that was created by the Climate Change Act in 2008. We have a series of statutory duties, which include, first and foremost, setting what are called the carbon budgets. So these are 5-year-long budget periods for emissions. We have just in December 2020 set the 6th carbon budget for the UK, and this was passed through Parliament last year. And that sets the level of emissions that the UK can produce over the period of 2032 to 2037. We're currently in the 3rd carbon budget period, and we are on track to deliver lower emissions than before. Although the 4th carbon budget is going to be a challenging step forward that the government and the UK will need to meet. Another one of our duties is we produce every 3 years an independent assessment of climate risk. This looks at the need for adaptation against changing world. So flooding, heat waves, extreme weather events, and we provide advice on how well the UK is prepared for that and what government policies can do to support it. And then the other thing we do is we produce an annual report to Parliament detailing the government's progress on climate and how its policies are making that more or less successful. So, how have we done to date? Since 1990, which is sort of generally held as the sort of marker for the sort of start point on this whole process around the world, UK emissions have fallen, both our consumption and territorial emissions. So the consumption emissions include emissions from overseas. So for example, if you buy a TV made in, say, South Korea, consumption emissions account for the emissions in that process. At the same time, the economy has grown, puts to the notion that you can't have economic growth and emissions reductions. The two very much, coexist, and actually, in many ways, pursuing net zero is something that may be a driver of economic growth in the coming years. But as you dive under the bonnet, you'll start to see that the story is not quite so simple as all that. So the UK has enjoyed significant success decarbonising its power sector. So the shift away from coal to renewables, particularly offshore wind in the North Sea, which is basically the best place in the world to build offshore wind, has been hugely successful, has actually helped the UK reduce its emissions more than pretty much any other comparable nation. We've also seen progress in manufacturing, construction, and some of the smaller sectors such as waste and industry. And as you all note, surface transport has took a bit of a dive during 2020, during the pandemic, but the trajectory there is probably going to be sustained as the uptake of electric vehicles grows over coming years. Buildings, on the other hand, has been a tricky one. There hasn't been much progress there for various reasons, and it's now the 2nd largest source of emissions in the UK and likely to become the largest in the near future. Since 1990, emissions from buildings have only fallen by about 17%, in contrast to 80% in the electricity sector. And this points to the challenge of decarbonising homes. But where there is a challenge, there is also an opportunity. This means that there are scope for us to do a lot here with policies and technologies that are readily available. We don't need some sort of massive leap forward as we do perhaps in, say, aviation. So the base of the challenge is the UK has the oldest homes in Europe, and older homes are less energy efficient. So EPCC, which you can see there on the right, is sort of our baseline for where homes should be going forward. In the long term, we want to get them up to sort of EPC B or ideally A. But as you can see, old homes are struggling even to meet EPCC in many cases. The UK's housing stock is old for various reasons. Partly it's due to the planning system. It's quite hard to knock down and build new homes. Partly it's due to our preferences, like people like to live in, Victorian terraces and, old thatched cottages from the 1600s. This is something we have to work with. And so the challenge is finding ways to both retrofit our existing homes in ways that not only makes them more compatible with the net zero ambition, but also just makes them better homes to live in. So we want homes that are warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, require less energy to operate. They are better ventilated, less damp. And this all comes together as part of the package that we need to get to net zero in buildings. So home energy efficiency in particular has improved very slowly, and it's not perhaps easiest to see on this chart, but there is definitely a plateau sort of post 2015 when government policies sort of took a turn away from things like loft and cavity insulation and stuff like that, and there was definitely a slowing of progress which has picked up since, but we still have a long way to go. The social sector is better than private homes, but if you remember that 80 is the value for EPCC, we've definitely got work to do. So the SAP rating, the standard assessment procedure, is a analysis that a surveyor will do on your house that gives you a score, and this takes into sort of this factors in things like the material the house is made out of, the types of insulation it has, the number of windows it has, calculations about whether you have carpets or wood floors, where you are in a building if you're in a block of flats, and that score is what gives you your EPC rating. So the EPCs are bands of SAP ratings, as it were, and the SAP methodology is quite complex. The EPC one is a bit more crude, but SAP is a pretty good measure of sort of how buildings perform in general. So the CCC has been looking at how to reduce emissions from homes for quite a while, and the first thing to sort of take away is how homes use energy, and the bulk of the energy use in homes is for heating and hot water, so boilers basically. Appliances is a third source of energy use, so this is predominantly washing and drying, TVs. You'll note that lighting took an interesting turn in between 2005 and 2010 when the ban on incandescent bulbs came in. And I think one of my favorite statistics is, as I recall, the peak demand from lighting in the UK dropped by an amount equivalent to a nuclear power station, a large nuclear power station, as a result of that single policy change. So that has been hugely successful. And it does prove how policy can move the dial on these things in quite remarkable ways. Sadly, we don't have anything quite as simple as that switch for space heating and hot water. But the good thing is that the technologies we need to make that change and shift how we use energy from high carbon sources to low carbon ones is readily available. What I would note is we don't necessarily expect heating to use substantially less energy like the lighting. Heat pumps are more efficient than gas boilers or oil boilers, but there will still be a substantial heat demand, and there will also be a growing demand for cooling as we face hotter summers, and so that is something else to consider going forward. So the way we think about this in terms of emissions is we think about the direct emissions from homes. So this is the carbon that's produced by basically burning fossil fuels, so gas, oil, coal, and biomass such as wood. Predominantly we use this for space heating, but we also use it for cooking. You might have a gas hob or an Aga. But we also, the greenhouse gas inventory that we use is incredibly detailed and counts things like the petrol you use in your lawnmower against your home emissions. So electric lawnmowers will be another thing I think that we'll be pushing people towards in a very small way. But we also think about the indirect emissions from buildings. So this is where, you know, if your appliances are using electricity from high carbon sources, such as coal or gas, that's an indirect emission from homes that we want to reduce. And another idea is this idea of embodied carbon, which is the sort of sum of all the carbon emissions associated with the construction of the building, both in terms of the materials used. So if you're using, say, concrete, there is a carbon cost associated with that, but also the building practices, such as, you know, how far you've had to ship the materials, the machinery you use on site, and so on and so forth. So as I noted, 83% of the energy use in homes is for space heating and hot water. And the most common source of this in the UK is gas boilers. Currently, the current energy policies favour gas over electricity in terms of where the levies are applied, the taxes on the fuels. And this made sense because, you know, for the longest time, the UK enjoyed the resource of, you know, cheap, very clean gas from the North Sea. But we cannot keep burning gas if we want to reach net zero. And what we need is people to shift back from gas to electricity in a very significant way. In the future, we want our homes to use electricity from low carbon renewable sources such as wind, nuclear, and solar to provide, you know, that heating and hot water demand. We also want our homes to be well insulated so that they not only use less energy to heat, but they lose less heat. There was a study out recently that showed that the UK has some of the worst heat retention in Western and Northern Europe. So UK homes lose, a typical home in the study heated to 20 degrees C when the outside environment was 0, lost 3 degrees of heat overnight, compared to Germany, where the average home in the study lost only 0.9, comparable homes. But as noted also, cooling is an increasing challenge for UK homes. So a lot of our advice also thinks about the use of shading and ventilation, both natural and artificial. And we also want homes that minimize the amount of embodied carbon. So this would be using more timber in construction, because timber, obviously, that is net negative. You've taken carbon out of the atmosphere to create the trees, and using it in construction is a good way to sort of store and sequester carbon. So first of all, what does a low carbon sustainable home retrofit look like? So this is thinking about the changes that we expect and we are looking for policies to deliver across the UK. And I'm happy to talk about some of the sort of specific programs the government has set up to push this. But I think just in very broad terms, the things we are looking for, as I noted, is better insulation, particularly lofts and walls. There are other ways to do insulation, you know, like underfloor, but lofts and walls are where you get most of the benefit. Double or triple glazing is another way to sort of massively improve the energy efficiency of homes, but also bring in, on that cooling point, shading to sort of reduce heating in summers. Low carbon heating is the big one. This is going to be the big change for a lot of people. And so heat pumps is definitely going to be a major source of low carbon heat in the future, but not every home will be, you know, a heat pump won't be the optimal solution in every home, although I would note that the Energy Systems Catapult, who are a bunch of very bright people up in Birmingham, who we work with, have recently concluded a study that showed that there is potential for heat pumps to service every home in the UK. But we are allowing for things like district heat networks as part of the solution, particularly in heat-dense urban areas. So, you know, if you have an incinerator or an industrial cluster nearby, they may be able to provide you with waste heat. Electric resistive heating may be suitable in some homes, particularly those that are in very remote areas off the gas grid. And hydrogen is also a potential source of low carbon heating in the future, although that will depend on strategic decisions from government and will not necessarily be suitable everywhere. Other changes include draft proofing, using more efficient appliances. And one of the other things we think about with a view on the adaptation, the climate adaptation and resilience side, is thinking about not just heat stress and energy efficiency, but the water stress and water efficiency of homes. So using more water efficient devices such as low flow showers will both reduce energy demand and water demand. We're keen that homes should have incentives to create more green space around them. This both makes them more resilient to the effects of climate change, and also helps make them nicer spaces to live in. Again, this isn't just a purely sort of technocratic exercise in trying to reduce emissions. This is about making our lived environment better for all of us, healthy, more comfortable, more enjoyable. We also are advocating for ways to make homes more flood resistant, such as removable air brick covers, and thinking about encouraging people to move appliances within their homes and treat their flooring to make them more resistant. And the last thing is making increasing use of sort of smart home controls and smart tariffs, which enable people to be more flexible in how they buy and use energy. So there was a recent example of this where the cost of renewable wind fell dramatically, I think, because there was just a very gusty weather off the North Sea, and people on flexible tariffs who had electric vehicles were all shifting to charge at like 3 a.m. and saving a ton of money, while also helping balance the grid. So, these are things that will be very useful for us. And then we also think about what new build homes look like. And our starting point on new build homes is that they should not just meet the standard of retrofits, but they should be more ambitious. So one of the things, the starting point is that they should have very high levels of air tightness. And we expect that, in time, new build homes should move towards and eventually reach the Passive House standard developed by the Passive House Trust. We think new homes should have more fresh air with mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, and passive cooling solutions such as openable windows. Particularly an interesting point in the discussion now, more widely in buildings, is thinking about air filtration and the use of that to control the spread of viruses within the built environment. Triple glazing is standard in new homes, and low carbon heating too. One of the things we've been pretty adamant on is that there should be no new homes on the gas grid after 2025. And then similarly to the retrofits, more ambitious water efficiency standards, possibly there's a space for novel things like green roofs, reflective walls, similar flood resistance approaches. And then also, lastly, with new builds, particular focus on that embodied carbon and better construction and site planning, so that not only does the building process itself and the building itself use less carbon, but it creates environments where it's easier to use sustainable transport options such as, say, cycling or public transport. And it really has to sort of, the whole approach to homes has to sort of come from the ground up and has to incorporate planning from the outset. So just to give you some of our numbers, to give some perspective, this isn't necessarily going to be cheap. There are some cheap solutions, but they're not necessarily most effective. Loft insulation is cheap. The largest number of homes in the UK can make use of it. So we think there's about 13.3 million homes in the UK with potential to benefit from loft insulation now. The more effective insulation is things like external wall insulation. This can reduce the heat demand for a semi-detached house by up to 18%. But it is also expensive, and there are also challenges. It's, having someone come in to put the insulation in your loft is a sort of, 1 or 2 day thing, and it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Solid wall insulation is a much bigger challenge, and also obviously has implications for how your home looks or how much space you have in your rooms. So part of the policy thing is, part of the policy process is sort of identifying the costs and benefits and the trade-offs of different types of insulation and low carbon heat, and finding the best thing for individual people. And this is why I haven't really touched very much on this, but another big piece of this is sort of bringing in sort of local choice and local action as sort of, individual homeowners and local groups and local authorities identify the best low carbon heat and insulation solutions for their area, for their homes, for their needs. So people living on the coast down in Cornwall will probably have different sort of needs and expectations from people living in, say, the Tyneside in the city. So you may have seen recently OVO Energy put out some advice to stay warm in the winter, such as cuddle your pets, leave your oven open after cooking, eat some porridge, or do some star jumps. I can reassure you that these are not part of the formal or official CCC advice on steps you can do to manage the energy in your home. What we, in terms of like slightly more practical things that don't involve getting the builders in, advice we provide, is that, people can improve the efficiency of their home in simple ways, using low energy lighting, looking for like small insulation things like around hot water tanks, low flow shower heads, draft proofing, and just being smarter with how people use energy. So like that. Another big one is checking that the heating system is actually working correctly. The standard new boiler these days, gas boiler, is a condensing boiler. But however, the majority of gas boilers in the UK have been, at least according to studies we've been given, are installed wrong and run at far too high a temperature. If they run above 55 degrees, they don't condense. And this neutralizes all the benefit. So if you have a condensing boiler, make sure that it's not operating above 55 degrees C. And then obviously, things like room timers and room thermostats can really help make your heating system run more efficiently. And then lastly, again, recognizing the risk of heat waves, ways to reduce the risk of overheating in summer, using fans, keeping curtains or blinds shut during the day. And then the last piece of general sort of advice we put out is, if you're at risk of flooding, sign up for flood warnings and devise a plan to deal with floods. So those are sort of the changes, that you could make in your homes, or we're looking for people to make in homes. And, from the sort of very simple up to the very big. And, what we're looking to government to do is provide policies and advice that support those at every level. So what is the government actually doing? So in October, it published its long overdue heat and building strategy. We laid out, when we published the sixth carbon budget in December 2020, was a sort of an indicative timeline out to 2037. So we think that the future home standard, which will set standards for new builds, needs to come into force by 2025. So that would raise homes to the standard I discussed a couple of slides ago. And no new homes could be connected to the gas grid past that point, because then all we do is creating a retrofit problem for us in the sort of mid to late 2030s. From 2028, homes in the private rented sector and social housing sector need to be EPCC. So that was a SAP score of 80 at the point of tenancy. And similarly, all homes that are for sale need to be, a similar level of efficiency at the point of sale. This would involve, sort of new standards on mortgage lenders. We also called for the government to phase out the installation of new oil boilers from 2028. So homes off the gas grid will be the ones sort of leading, and new builds will be the one leading the way on things like heat pumps and heat networks. And, but there is obviously a space in there for hybrid boilers, hydrogen boilers and hybrid heat pumps as well. This is something that the government needs to work out over the next few years. And then 2033 would be phasing out comparable installations of new gas boilers. And then the overarching thing we've been looking for in government policy is 4 points, as you can sort of see on the right. And the first is for them to set a clear direction. It's to sort of tell people what to expect. We've gone through a long period of figuring out what we need to do. We now know that. It's now for government to sort of communicate that and, get on with it, which is actually point 4. So this is sort of setting standards, legislating for dates when these things will happen, so that homeowners and the market and the industry can all sort of prepare for that. One of the things we saw with the Green Homes Grant, which was put in place during the pandemic, is that it tried to sort of do too much too quickly and the supply chains couldn't cope. So providing that sort of forward signal is really important in our view. Another big part of it is making low carbon financially attractive. This is definitely pertinent at the moment with the energy price crisis. Currently, the levies are on, as I mentioned, on electricity rather than gas, but the price of gas is shooting up. So it's difficult to move the levies across. But what we really want is people to be using electricity in the long run. So we want electricity to become cheaper, but we also want there to be funding to support people to make the transition from gas to electricity, particularly, as Peter mentioned, people who are in fuel poverty, who cannot afford to make these changes. So this would be funding for the fuel poor, but also thinking about things like green mortgages and other financial products that could help be able to pay owner-occupiers, make those efficiency improvements, and install low-carbon heating in their own homes. And then the other thing is a real focus on enabling measures. So none of this is going to get done without a skilled workforce. Upskilling, retraining, or training new people to do things like, provide insulation assurance, to do surveying, to install heat pumps, but also, more relevant to you, we're going to need a lot more engineers working on things like grid reinforcement and figuring out how to do district heating networks and coming up with other creative infrastructure solutions. We're also going to need, better use of data, the use of data to sort of inform where demand is happening in real time, to inform planning is currently quite thin and not shared very well. So better collection and storage and sharing of data is something we want to work on. And then also, obviously, we need quite extensive reforms to both planning and governance. We need ways for central government to work with local government to support them as they make plans, as they sort of work out where the best solution is and where that has to be. And then lastly, our point, as I mentioned at the top, is they just need to get on with it. So, we're past the phase of deliberation and consultation. It's obviously important for government to keep listening to people and keep adjusting its plans, but action is what we need now, and that's really what we're looking for. My last thought is, if you ever want to get in touch, please feel free to get in touch with us. We're at 1 Victoria Street, or you can follow us on Twitter. But thank you very much.